In the summer of 1992, the savage killing of Rachel Nickell shocked the nation. It sparked a huge murder inquiry. In a groundbreaking operation, police used an undercover detective in a honey trap. They arrested their prime suspect.
You ambushed her, and you pushed the little boy face down into the mud. Then you stabbed Rachel 14 times.
But the operation turned out to be deeply flawed.
The police are fallible, and in this case, they got the wrong man.
Rachel Nickell's killer remains at large. What went wrong? Wimbledon Common, South London. 1,100 acres of woods and fields. By mid-morning on July the 15th, 1992, the Common was filling up with visitors. But just 300 yards away from the main car park, a secluded wooded area concealed a horrific scene. Michael Murray is a retired architect. At about 10:35, he was taking his dog for a walk.
We came up this path, and I saw what I thought was someone sunbathing. I saw a bare leg. But as we got closer, I realized that this was something quite different and horribly tragic. There was a small child of 2 or 3 years old who was pulling at the arm of his mother, who was lying covered with blood on the ground. I heard the child shouting, "Get up, Mummy, get up." It was heartrending. She needed levering off. His hand was gripped tight round the mother's arm. And he was just hysterical with distress. Poor thing was covered in blood.
The police quickly sealed off the scene. One of the first to arrive was Detective Chief Inspector Mick Wickerson.
And I can honestly tell you that this is the most horrendous and vicious attack that I've ever seen. It was a beautiful blonde girl with the most horrendous throat injury, and she was soaked in blood. And then, of course, the true horror of what had happened hit me.
From the outset, it was clear that this murder would attract intense media interest.
She was a very attractive young mother, and that is one element that attracted so much media attention. The time of her death was relatively early in the morning, so every news bulletin, every newspaper could get the maximum of that day's coverage.
Clearly, it was an absolutely horrific attack. That says to the folks on the streets, we're dealing with a psychopath here. Secondly, the fact that the young boy was involved. Journalists have children too, and would have appreciated, that this is a sort of dark nightmare for every parent in the land.
More than 500 people had been on the Common that morning. The police allowed them to depart after taking their details. Only one vehicle remained. It belonged to the murder victim. 23-year-old Rachel Nickell lived in Balham. She had taken her son Alex to Wimbledon Common for walks because she felt safer there than in the parks nearer her home. Rachel's partner, and the father of little Alex, was Andre Hanscom. He'd once been a tennis coach and was now a motorcycle courier. Suddenly, he was thrust into the media spotlight.
I led him through the door, and he was taken aback by the number of flashbulbs and interest. And we sat down together, and I held his hand under the table, and just sort of gave it a reassuring squeeze every so often.
I would say to anybody who does know this person, no matter how they feel about them, please come forward before he destroys anybody else's life.
Rachel's parents, Andrew and Monica Nickell, were holidaying in Canada. It took the police 4 days to trace them. Paul Miller was sent out to break the tragic news before the press did.
Andrew stood there and took it all in, took one sharp intake of breath when I mentioned her throat. He took me to one side and said, I will never ever forget what you've done for my family. Thank you so much. It just blew me away. I'd given him the worst news imaginable. And there he was, thanking me for what I'd done. What had I done?
She can never be replaced in our lives. We can only try and slowly pick up the pieces. But our lives will always be less rich than when she was alive.
The murder squad was based at Wimbledon, led by Detective Superintendent John Bassett. The crucial role of evaluating suspects was given to a newcomer from the flying squad.
Yeah, 993 from OP1. No sign of any suspects.
Keith Pedder had just been promoted from Detective Sergeant to Inspector.
We'll let you know in the next couple of minutes.
Aged 35, he was bright and ambitious. Pedder would become the driving force on the squad.
The fact that we had no one coming forward saying that they'd actually seen a blood-stained man decamping from the common surprised me, and it struck me at the time that whoever was responsible for this had had the luck of the devil.
The hunt for Rachel's killer would finish Keith Pedder's promising career and severely damage the reputation of the Metropolitan Police. Rachel Nickell's killer had disappeared without trace. Now police needed forensics to help track him down. Rachel had been sexually abused as well as stabbed. DNA evidence from a strand of hair or a trace of blood or semen could convict a suspect. The glade in the woods was examined in minute detail, but all to no effect.
We were faced with the appalling situation. We had no stranger's blood, we had no fibres, we had no hairs, we had no forensic evidence, we had no eyewitnesses. And the question that was uppermost in our minds is, where on earth do we start?
The post-mortem revealed the full extent of the savage attack. Rachel had been stabbed 49 times. Someone somewhere must have seen a blood-stained suspect.
Rachel's major bleeding injuries were actually to her neck, and it's my belief they were inflicted by someone standing behind or possibly to the side of her, in which case they may well not be covered in blood. The other stab wounds to the body probably wouldn't produce a large flow of blood that would contaminate someone. The forensic scientists would have been able to find the fine sprays of blood on the clothing of the assailant, but they wouldn't be apparent to someone walking past them on the road or on the common.
With no forensic evidence, detectives had to investigate a vast array of suspects. They considered Rachel's friends and contacts. They traced local sex offenders. They examined other murders for similarities. The squad had to eliminate nearly 600 suspects put forward by a concerned public.
They all were looked at. Despite some very, very intensive inquiries in respect of some of those other suspects, there was no evidence to put them either at the scene of the common or to link them with Rachel's death.
There was only one person who had seen the face of the killer. Rachel's son Alex, a month short of his 3rd birthday. Detectives hoped he might provide vital leads. Alex was taken to a child psychiatrist. She said that it would be painful but therapeutic for him to recall what happened. Seeing Alex relive the murder of his mother was a harrowing experience.
He would start playing with his toys. He would make a lot of noise. And the psychologist was saying, yeah, but could you help the people here catch this naughty man? What did he do, you know? And the noise would be getting louder and louder. And the boy was trying to shut it out completely. Your heart just bled. There was one occasion where he was writing on some paper and talking about the man that had hurt Mummy. And while we were sitting there, he had the pen in his hand and started jabbing the pen on the paper, faster and faster. And then he ran up to Andre with the pen like that, and it was dramatic to say the least.
Slowly, Alex revealed that the killer was a white man with short hair. He wore a white, buttoned, collared shirt, outside blue trousers. He had dark shoes. The man had produced the knife from a black bag. These sessions helped form the intense emotional bond between the murder squad and the Nickell family. They wanted this killer caught. At the scene of the crime, detectives set a trap. They hid a surveillance camera in a tree. Buried sensors were linked to an alarm. The ground around the site was soaked with an invisible chemical that would mark a suspect's shoes.
Had we actually had someone at the scene who then later denied it was him, we could actually say, well, yes, it was you, because we had this specific chemical. It was thorough. It was complete.
The police kept watch around the clock. Then the sensors were triggered. Officers moved in, only to find a group of intoxicated teenagers. The press got hold of the story, and the surveillance team had to be withdrawn. After 2 weeks, the investigation was making little headway. It was time for a radical new approach. Could a psychologist come up with a profile of the kind of man who might have committed such a horrific murder?
What you have with a psychologist usually is an insight into the criminal mind. I think where it is very effective is in serial murders and sexual offences such as rape, where there is a certain psychotic implant which is used by some of the most prolific offenders.
Senior officers brought in forensic psychologist Paul Britton. He was briefed by detectives and visited the murder scene. Like the fictional cracker, he now had to think himself into the mind of the murderer.
Closing my eyes, I tried to step back into the pretty woodland glade on Wimbledon Common. An image was forming in my mind. I knew how this killer functioned. I knew what drove him, because I had seen the same impulse in other people whom I'd interviewed and treated over the years. I knew this killing was a decisive stage in a fantasy process that had been rehearsed for years before it ever became a reality.
Britton's handwritten offender profile aimed to help the police narrow down their list of suspects. Among other things, it said that the killer would live within easy walking distance of Wimbledon Common. He would probably be between 20 and 30 years old. He would be single and isolated, living at home with a parent or alone in a flat or bedsit. He would have a history of failed or unsatisfactory relationships. His hobbies and interests would be unusual. Most worrying of all, Britain predicted that it was almost inevitable that the killer would strike again. But it was traditional detective work that brought the first breakthrough. Police analyzed hundreds of witness statements and realized one particular woman had seen a man behaving suspiciously minutes before the murder. She helped create an artist's impression. Was this the face of Rachel's killer?
Tonight, detectives are putting all their cards on the table, and they're appealing for the whole nation's help. The man was in his 20s or 30s. He was tall, more than 5 feet 10, and had short brown hair. He had a white shirt with buttons and dark trousers, possibly blue, and was carrying a small, dark bag. Curiously, his belt was over his shirt rather than round his trousers. Or perhaps it was a dog lead. He seemed to bend forward slightly as he walked. Was he trying to hide his face?
Some 800 viewers rang in. Several people named the same man. He lived on the Roehampton estate, less than a mile from the site on Wimbledon Common where Rachel Nickell was found. Police believed Colin Stagg was a good match to the artist's impression and Paul Britton's offender profile. He was 29 years old, unemployed and unmarried.
I was just in complete shock, because at that time I didn't know the difference between being arrested and being charged. So as far as I was concerned then, I was being charged for the murder of Rachel Nickell.
The offender profile had also said that the killer would have unusual interests. Inside Colin Stagg's flat, Keith Pedder was astonished by what he found.
The back bedroom had drawing of pagan deities on the walls. There was a pentagram marked out on the carpet. There was also a hooded black cowl and habit in the wardrobe. Quite clearly, we were dealing with a very unusual individual.
Detectives now had 3 days to interview Colin Stagg. He was rapidly becoming their prime suspect.
It was very, very difficult to actually pin Colin down to answer specific questions. You would ask him a question, put something very pointed to him, and he would come up with the most illogical response by way of answer.
I was getting more and more frightened, and I couldn't think of anything coherent to say, so my words were being mixed up, and that was being used against me. I couldn't think clearly about what times I was on the common that morning, and I was getting that wrong, and and it was just really a stressful time for me.
Pedder asked Stagg to describe his movements on the day of the murder. He said he had taken his dog for a short walk on the common sometime between 8:15 and 9:15.
The only people I saw was a dark-haired woman with her hair up, pushing a buggy with a child in it, and I said good morning to her as I passed her, and she said good morning back. Behind her was a broad man, short dark hair, quite a menacing looking bloke.
We checked our database of witnesses and people who said they were on the common at the time, and we could find nobody who matched the descriptions that Colin had given us.
Rachel Nickell had been killed at around 10:30. Colin Stagg's alibi was that he was back home by 9:15. But one of his neighbours, Mrs. Susan Gale, told police that she had seen him going onto the common at about 9:25 a.m.
I remember clearly the meeting she described in her statement, but it was not the day of the murder, and she has got that day wrong.
We went back to Mrs. Gale and said, are you sure it was the day? Are you certain of the time? And she was totally adamant.
You kept walking. And then I carried on walking, and then my youngest son...
This woman, Jane Harriman, had described a man seen acting suspiciously at about 10:10. It was her artist's impression that was shown on Crime Watch.
And he paused, and I sort of looked at him to smile, and he half smiled and turned his face away. He didn't look at me, he just turned his head away, and he seemed unsure of which way to go, and I didn't look back. Then I carried on walking past.
Mrs. Harriman had taken her children to a nearby pond. A few minutes later, she'd seen the same suspicious man. She was concerned because she thought he was following a woman. At 10:23, she saw him for a third time, heading in a new direction. This would have put him in the right place at the right time to have killed Rachel.
This individual was not me, because the description of this man is a much taller individual, and loads of people have commented on what basically a short-ass git I am, you know. There's no way I can be described as being a tall man.
2 days after his arrest, Colin Stagg was taken to an identity parade at Brixton Police Station. There, Mrs. Harriman identified him as the man she'd seen on Wimbledon Common. Detectives now believed that Colin Stagg was the killer, though they did not have enough evidence to charge him. The only thing he owned up to was nude sunbathing on the common. This matched a complaint from a woman about a flasher. So Stagg was charged with indecency. At Wimbledon Magistrates' Court on the 21st of September, he admitted indecent exposure and was fined £200. For the media, Colin Stagg was now an irresistible target.
Once he had that conviction, it was a sort of signal to news editors that we were right. We were right to suspect this man. And it may be the police were not unhappy about the press following that agenda.
The publicity had one result that would change the whole direction of the inquiry. Detectives were contacted by a woman called Julie. Some 2 years earlier, she had placed an ad in a Lonely Hearts column. Colin Stagg had replied and had almost immediately sent her a graphic sexual fantasy letter. This letter gave Keith Pedder the idea for an audacious undercover operation. Might Colin Stagg be encouraged to reveal his deepest fantasies to an undercover detective? And would those fantasies match those of the killer, as assessed by Paul Britton?
These would include the use of a knife to stimulate, penetrate, and control the woman in his fantasy. As he reveals more, the fantasies would increasingly come to feature a venue that closely resembles the woodland in which Rachel was murdered. At their highest intensity, they would replay important aspects of the killing itself, and the offender would derive potent gratification from recounting them.
The idea was to obtain evidence, physical evidence would have been ideal. The knife used to murder Rachel, with her blood on, his fingerprints on, clothing that he had worn on the day with Rachel's blood on, that would have taken the inquiry to another level.
Keith Pedder believed the undercover operation would eliminate Colin Stagg from the inquiry, or prove his guilt.
One of my colleagues came up to me and said, "You realise that if it goes wrong, that's your career buggered."
We were treading on new ground. We were sailing uncharted waters. It was completely new, but we didn't know what else to do.
Pedder's daring plan was now approved at Deputy Assistant Commissioner level. No one could predict what would happen next. January 1993. At his flat near Wimbledon Common, Colin Stagg received a letter. Unknown to him, it had been composed by Keith Pedder and an undercover detective known only as Lizzie James.
Dear Colin, I hope you're not offended by this intrusion, as we have never met before, but I feel that I've known you for years. You may remember writing to a woman called Julie. Julie was an old friend of mine, and a little old-fashioned in her outlook, if you know what I mean. A while ago, while she was out, I read a letter that you sent her. I would be very interested in getting to know you more.
At that time, I still had no real sexual contact with any women. Bit of a late starter. I thought, well, you know, I've got nothing else going for me. You know, it's not as if I've got women queuing at the door for me, is it? So, yeah, I jumped at the chance.
Over the next 7 months, Colin Stagg and Lizzie James would exchange 43 letters. Forensic psychologist Paul Britton had helped design the covert operation and monitored the correspondence.
The underpinning factor was that we should not introduce new themes that hadn't already been introduced into the correspondence by Colin Stagg. I suppose the analogy would be that if he hopped onto one step, we would hop onto it after him.
But the defence would later call an expert to allege that the police were shaping Colin Stagg's replies.
The inducement really was, you can have sex with me and we'll have a loving relationship, but unless you committed the murder of Rachel Nickell, you're no good to me and the relationship will be terminated.
In early March 1993, Lizzie James wrote to encourage Colin Stagg to be more explicit in his letters.
I can't help but think you are showing great restraint. You are showing control when you feel like bursting. I want you to burst. I want you to feel all-powerful and overwhelming, so that I'm completely in your power, defenseless and humiliated.
She is saying to him, you're not opening up enough. You're not giving me what I want. I want somebody who's dominant. I want somebody who can humiliate me, and that's really going to turn me on. And that is sort of clear evidence of her trying to shape his answers.
Colin Stagg replied on the 18th of March.
Your letter was great. I have now some idea what you want. I've written another special for you along those lines. I've called you a few dirty names whilst writing it, but please don't think I am a violent man. You will be left humiliated and dirty. I want to and will give you a fucking good sorting out. You need a damn good fucking by a real man, and I'm the one to do it.
And he's sort of saying, I'll do this, but I don't really mean it. I'm not going to be hurting you in any way. So he is trying to fit in with what she wants, but doing it in a rather gentle way.
By May 1993, Colin Stagg was pressing for a date with Lizzie James. The acting skills she'd used inside criminal gangs would now be deployed against him.
She can be anything to anybody. Her ability to think on her feet and make good, valid, instant decisions made her ideally suited for this particular scenario.
Waiting in the rain in Hyde Park, Lizzie James was about to embark on a psychological battle of wits. Could she persuade Colin Stagg to reveal his innermost secrets?
She had been given a very, very detailed briefing by Paul Britton as to what to expect, how to behave. Not only had she got to play her part, she also had to stay, as far as possible, within the realms of what is accepted legally. The task facing her was one that would frighten the living daylights out of most people.
Inside an unmarked van, Keith Pedder and Mick Wickerson monitored the operation.
You could cut the air with the tension. We were obviously listening to it. We had numerous police officers surrounding them, but wow, they were close, and it was very, very tense.
Colin Stagg arrived early and waited watching under a large tree. Detectives were concerned. Was he suspicious of Lizzie James?
I was basically just waiting under this tree. It wasn't the type of weather I liked to be out in anyway. And I was actually thinking about, you know, just going home, forgetting all about it. And then I saw a woman, and I thought, you know, that must be her. You know, there's nobody else about. And I approached her and I said, "Excuse me, are you Lizzie?"
It was Colin Stagg's 30th birthday. Lizzie James gave him a personal stereo and a baseball cap. She'd chosen the cap to make him more conspicuous to detectives following him.
I felt very uncomfortable because it was a public place. I don't like eating in public. I've never been to restaurants before, and I was very clumsy. I was stumbling. I was very Hugh Grantish, you know, without the accent, you know.
To encourage Colin Stagg to confide in her, Lizzie James now confessed to a secret of her own. Her lurid cover story, created by Paul Britton, was that she had been abused as a teenager by an occult group. She had joined in the ritual murder of a young woman and baby.
He asked me to cut the woman's throat. And with the cup, I caught the woman's blood. There was this big orgy, and I was with this man. This man was the best ever.
When this horrific tale unfolded, the reaction from Colin Stagg was almost nothing. Very, very matter of fact. A reaction that I certainly hadn't expected. I would have expected at that stage, good night, Vienna.
I just thought she was off her head more than anything. I don't think I really believed the story. I think it was an idea, perhaps, that appealed to her more than anything, and that's what basically turned her on. But at the end of the day, all I wanted to do was have a shag, and that was it, you know.
At the end of the date, Colin Stagg walked Lizzie James to the park gates. Stagg now handed her a fantasy letter he'd written before the meeting. Keith Pedder claimed it introduced a disturbing new element of sexual violence into the correspondence. Further proof he was onto the right man.
The contents included a sexual fantasy on Wimbledon Common, which involved the use of a knife, the cutting of flesh, and the flowing of blood. And this was the first time that there had been any indication, any mention of knives or blood, or the use of any of those items for sexual gratification.
Paul Britton alleged Stagg's letter displayed a rare and highly deviant sexuality.
The chances of there being two such men on Wimbledon Common when Rachel was murdered are incredibly small.
Basically, I was drawing up on my own experiences of what I've read and what I know about the occult, that a knife is always used. And also, I mean, it's not that hard for human beings to make up stories.
That Stagg never introduced any theme. If Stagg mentioned the knife first, it was in response to suggestions that any idiot, frankly, would have picked up on, that they wanted the fantasies to become more extreme.
The police felt that Colin Stagg was at last opening up and revealing his secrets. Lizzie James sent him a graphic sex fantasy on tape to keep up the pressure. During a series of secretly taped meetings, Lizzie James now pushed Stagg about Rachel's murder, after he'd told her he'd been arrested and questioned about it.
To tell you the truth, they think I did it, even now. I got pulled over by the police bank holiday Monday, May 31st.
I wish you had done it, and knowing you'd got away with it. That's brilliant. I wish you had.
Legally, Lizzie James was dangerously close to the edge. She was openly enticing Stagg to confess. But confession was the last thing on Stagg's mind.
Almost a year after Mum Rachel Nickell was raped and stabbed to death on London's Wimbledon Common, the man who was the police's prime suspect has told the Daily Star, "I didn't kill her."
With such a public denial, he was unlikely to say in private or disclose to Lizzie James anything that contradicted what was said in that article, therefore undoing 4 or 5 months of painstaking work.
On many occasions, Scotland Yard will call in the senior editors and they'll say, look, publicity in this case is going to cause us a major problem. They chose not to. Now, why they chose not to is a matter for them, but they clearly can't accuse newspapers of scuppering their inquiry when the newspapers are unaware of the tone that inquiry is taking.
In a final meeting, Lizzie James pressed even harder. Stagg revealed details about Rachel Nickell's body, details that the police believed only the murderer could have known. When Keith Pedder interviewed Colin Stagg in September 1992, he had shown him a photograph of the murder scene to try and shock a reaction out of him.
It was a distant shot and from the back. Her hands couldn't be seen, her head couldn't be seen. It was more a scene-setting photograph rather than one of the detailed scenes of crimes photographs.
Now, at a picnic in Hyde Park 10 months later, Lizzie James claimed Colin Stagg had clearly demonstrated the position of Rachel Nickell's hands, palm to palm.
That was something that was uncannily accurate to the way that Rachel was found, and again could not have been seen from the photograph that he had been shown in a much earlier interview.
In fact, Rachel's hands had been left crossed at the wrists.
I basically tried to show her what I could remember from the photograph. I placed both my hands palm down on the ground and to try and lower myself into a kind of fetal position, and I tried to show that, and the photograph was taken from the rear end. And as I straightened myself up, I brushed my hands from the husks of the beech nut of the tree, which are small prickly things. So, but the fact of the matter is, at no time whatsoever did my hands come into contact either across the wrists or palm to palm.
In essence, Colin Stagg was being given a choice: admit more knowledge about the killing, or kiss goodbye to Lizzie James.
I don't know what to say, you know. Well, I never really met anybody like you, you know. Since you first started writing to me and that, you know, it's like a dream come true for me, you know.
If you're not that man, and not done that kind of thing, you'll never, ever, ever be able to fulfill me. You'll never, Colin. Never.
Despite these enticements, Colin Stagg never admitted killing Rachel. The operation was aborted. Would the evidence police had acquired stand up in court? At dawn on the 17th of August, 1993, Colin Stagg was arrested for the second time.
I was just dumbstruck. You know, I just thought, you know, this is the end. You know, my life's coming to an end. You know, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison for something I didn't do.
Tonight, several police forensic experts moved into Colin Stagg's neat garden in southwest London and started digging deep holes. They collected several objects in a black plastic bag.
This time, Colin Stagg chose to exercise his right to silence.
I gave you every opportunity. I've given you the opportunity now. If you were on the common but didn't do it, tell us. No comment. Colin, do you propose to answer any questions that I'm going to put to you? No comment.
Psychologist Paul Britton had a video link to the interrogation. He and the police had agreed a strategy to get Stagg talking by having Lizzie James walk into the interview unannounced.
That's not true. No comment.
The signal was rubbing my ear, and at that point there was a pause in the questioning, and you could hear footsteps along the corridor. Then there was a knock on the door. Lizzie James came in and introduced herself.
Yes, I'm a serving police officer. For the purposes of this interview, I'm known as Lizzie James.
There was a look of shock on Colin's face, and that was quickly replaced by one of what I would describe as anger.
And I thought, I haven't murdered anybody just because I wrote dirty letters, for God's sake. You know, it doesn't make you a murderer.
Isn't there anything you want to say to me, Colin? It'll be your last opportunity.
Stagg now knew he had been set up, but he continued to make no comment. He was formally charged with the murder of Rachel Nickell.
It is 11 minutes to 7. We're now switching the tape off.
Colin Stagg would spend the next 13 months remanded in custody. The police case against him was not strong. It still lacked any forensic evidence. But it was underpinned by psychologist Paul Britton, who argued that a man's deviant sexual fantasies could identify him as a murderer. This controversial form of identification had never been put before a British court.
In effect, what Mr. Britton was purporting to do was to use his psychological profile to identify Colin Stagg as the killer. But what that presupposes is that the psychological profile was correct.
Nevertheless, the Crown Prosecution Service felt there were grounds to proceed. A stipendiary magistrate decided that Stagg had a case to answer and committed him for trial at the Old Bailey. The police now looked forward to the evidence being tested before a jury.
We thought that we had a case that was winnable. At no stage did we believe that we were fatally flawed in law. We thought we had a viable chance of a successful prosecution.
Colin Stagg was brought to trial. But even before a jury was sworn in, his defence team argued that the undercover Lizzie James material should be ruled inadmissible and thrown out. The judge, Mr. Justice Ognall, took several days to consider before delivering his ruling on the 14th of September 1994.
The atmosphere in the court that day was electric. There was a sense that after Lord knows how many man-hours spent investigating this pretty appalling crime, that we were coming to a head.
The final moment came. We was ordered upstairs. But halfway up this stairwell, the officer in front of me stopped me. He said, "Hold on, they're not ready yet." And then the officer turned around to the other officer and he said, "You know, blimey, it's packed up here. I've never seen this place like this before."
Colin Stagg sat passively in the dock. The Nickells were sitting apprehensively at the back of the court. And Keith Pedder and I were sitting directly under Judge Harry Ognall. And we didn't know what he was going to say.
Mr. Justice Ognall rejected as dangerous the idea that a psychological profile could be admissible as expert evidence to prove identity.
The judge made his ruling, which seemed to go on forever. I couldn't understand most of the legal jargon, obviously. And there was a moment when Bill Clegg, my QC, turned round and gave me a sort of sly wink and a grin. And I thought, yes, it's going my way.
The judge went on to condemn the undercover operation as
a substantial attempt to incriminate a suspect by positive and deceptive conduct of the grossest kind.
The aggressiveness of the judgment just shocked us. We were sitting there while he put the knife in and turned it and hung us up to be dried out in front of everybody.
Mr. Justice Ognall ruled that all the material gathered by the undercover operation was improper, unfair, and inadmissible. The prosecution collapsed, and no further evidence was offered against Colin Stagg.
I was expecting the judge to either say, you know, you're guilty, you're going down, or you're an innocent man, you're free. But none of that was said. So I felt I was in limbo. But Jim Sturman approached me, he put his hand up to me and said, congratulations, I'll see you round the back. And I looked at him, I went, what? What was going on, sort of thing, you know? I was that kind of, dumbstruck.
Police condemned as Rachel Nickell murder trial collapses.
The sensational collapse of the case against Colin Stagg dominated the news headlines.
The judge recognised that there was never any evidence against me, no forensic evidence, no confession evidence, nothing at all.
But for Rachel's parents, Andrew and Monica Nickell, the outcome was devastating.
The law has been upheld, but where is the justice? I understand that the police will now keep the files on my daughter's murder open, but they are not looking for anyone else.
Keith Pedder was treated like a pariah. He was criticised, he was not supported after the judgment, and he had no career, and he suffered enormously from that day onwards.
The murder of Rachel Nickell remains one of the great unsolved crimes of the 20th century. I think her death touched everybody. Many of us have children. Many of us go walking in the park. None of us expect to be attacked.
It's one of the images that will never go away. I haven't been back to Wimbledon Common since, and I resent that. I think every woman should be free to walk in the woods with her child.
At the end of the day, he's still out there, but until he's finally caught, no woman is safe.
Colin Stagg has been through a version of justice, albeit truncated, and he has been found not guilty. But I wonder whether he can actually say, hand on heart, that he believes people, when they meet him in the street, believe that. But I do not believe the system served anybody that particular day.
And next week at 11, Real Life looks at one man, 6 wives.